I've lived in this neighborhood my entire life. I know every street, every alley, every shortcut. At least I thought I did. But last night something changed. A wrong turn on a route I've taken 1,000 times has trapped me in a maze of unfamiliar streets. And no matter how hard I try, I can't find my way back. I swear the streets weren't like this before. Something is terribly, horribly wrong. The first jolt came when the streetlight above me flickered and went out, plunging the block into near-total darkness. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. The faint hum of electricity that always seemed to buzz in the background was gone, replaced by a deafening silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me. It was the overwhelming sense of absence. The familiar warmth of my neighborhood, the soft murmur of distant traffic, the glow of porch lights, even the rustling of leaves, had vanished, leaving the air feeling hollow and wrong. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder. The street behind me stretched longer than it should have, the houses warping in the corners of my vision like they were pulling away from me. The oak tree that had marked my left turn was gone, replaced by a strange, spindly tree with gnarled branches that seemed to reach for me. My breathing grew shallow as I walked faster, my shoes scuffing against the pavement. The windows of the houses lining the street were black and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching from behind the glass. I whispered to myself, trying to drown out the rising panic. Just keep moving. You know this street. But as I turned the next corner, my stomach dropped. I didn't recognize anything. The houses, the streetlights, the shadows, they were all wrong. My neighborhood had disappeared, and in its place was something cold, unfamiliar, and endless. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a faint whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized. I turned another corner, hoping to see something I knew, but the ground felt strange under my feet. I tripped, grabbing onto a damp, cold wall that wasn't supposed to be there. When I looked up, the street had changed again. The houses were closer now, leaning over me like they wanted to crush me. It was so quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound behind me. My heart started racing. I spun around, but no one was there. The sound didn't stop, though. It was like nails dragging across concrete. I started walking faster. My own footsteps sounded too loud, bouncing off the empty streets. Every turn I made led me to another strange place. The air felt colder, and it was harder to breathe. I kept looking around, sure the shadows were moving, even though I couldn't see anything. Then I saw a house with its front door hanging open. It creaked like someone had just walked in. My stomach tightened, but I found myself moving closer anyway. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The scraping noise grew louder, coming from inside the house. A shadow moved in the doorway, tall, thin, and not right. It swayed, almost like it wasn't fully real. I ran. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. The streets twisted around me, trapping me like a maze. Behind me, the scraping turned into a deep, growling noise. Whatever it was coming for me. I slowed down, gasping for breath, my chest tight from running. The growling sound had faded, but I wasn't safe. I could feel it. My legs wobbled as I stumbled onto another unfamiliar street, the houses lined up like silent sentinels. That's when I saw it. A window. The first window was dark, its glass cracked. At first it seemed empty, but as I walked past, I froze. Something moved behind the glass, a shadow. It was faint, almost human-shaped, but wrong, too tall, too thin. I took a shaky step back, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. My heart hammered as I turned to the next house. There it was again, another window, another shadow, just standing there, watching me. I turned my head quickly, scanning the other houses. Every window I looked at seemed to hold something, figures lurking just out of focus, faces pressed against the glass. Their pale, empty eyes followed me, unblinking, as I backed away. "Stop it," I whispered to myself, clenching my fists to keep them from trembling. They're not real. You're just scared." But then one of them moved. Slowly, the figure in the nearest window tilted its head, as if it knew I was watching. My stomach churned as its hand pressed against the glass, leaving a streak of something dark and wet. I ran again, but the windows were everywhere. The watchers were everywhere. And they weren't just watching anymore. They wanted me to know they were there. Section 4. I don't know how long I'd been running, but when I stopped, I realized something horrifying. My watch was blank. No numbers, no ticking hands. Just a smooth, empty face staring back at me like it had never worked at all. Panicking, I pulled out my phone. It wouldn't turn on. The screen stayed dark, no matter how many times I pressed the button. My breathing grew shallow as I tried to steady myself. The sky above hadn't changed. It was still the same inky black, the moon hanging unnaturally still, frozen like a painting. "Am I losing my mind?" I whispered, my voice shaking. I tried to count the seconds in my head, but even that felt wrong. Time wasn't moving. Or maybe I wasn't. The street stretched endlessly, and no matter how far I went, I kept passing the same crooked streetlight, the same tilted mailbox. It was as if the world had folded in on itself, looping me in some endless nightmare. Then I noticed the shadows. They weren't just on the ground anymore. They were crawling, stretching along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. One reached for me, long and thin, its movement unnaturally smooth. I stepped back, but the shadow stretched further, its jagged edges brushing my foot. The touch was ice cold like death itself. I screamed and ran, but it didn't matter. Time wasn't just slipping away, it was gone. Behind me I heard a faint, familiar sound. A laugh, low, guttural, and growing louder. Whatever was chasing me wasn't far now. Section 5. The fog appeared out of nowhere. It crept in so quickly that I didn't even notice until it was all around me. Thick and gray, it swallowed everything. The houses, the street, even the shadows that had been chasing me. My breath turned shallow as I realized I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Then I saw him. At first, it was just a shape in the fog, faint and blurry, standing perfectly still. I squinted, trying to make out the figure. It looked like a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a hat with a wide brim. Relief surged through me. Maybe it was someone who could help. "Hey," I shouted, my voice shaking. "Please, I'm lost." He didn't respond. He didn't even move. He just stood there, the fog swirling around him like it was alive. I took a cautious step closer. "Do you hear me? I need help." That's when he moved, but not like a person. His body glided forward without taking a step, smooth and unnatural, as if his feet weren't even touching the ground. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The fog shifted, and I caught a glimpse of his face, or the lack of it. The space where his features should have been was blank, an empty void that seemed to stare into me. I turned and ran, the fog growing colder and thicker with every step. Behind me, I could hear him following, his silent movements impossibly fast. He wasn't trying to help. He was hunting me. I ran until my legs burned, the fog swallowing every street behind me. The air grew colder with every step, and my breaths came out in harsh, uneven gasps. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him, gliding through the fog, silent and relentless. Then I saw it. A path. It wasn't supposed to be there. Cutting between two warped houses, it stretched into darkness, lined with trees so twisted and gnarled they looked like clawing hands. The dirt was uneven and damp, as if it hadn't been touched in years. My instincts screamed at me to stay away, but the fog behind me churned violently, and I had no choice. I stepped onto the path, the soft crunch of leaves breaking the silence. The moment I did, the air changed. It was heavier here, thick with a metallic scent that reminded me of blood. The trees loomed closer the further I went, their branches intertwining above me to block out the faint glow of the moon. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a flash of pale skin darting between the trees. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. A faint whisper floated through the air, so soft I couldn't make out the words. It was followed by a distant laugh, high and childlike, echoing from the darkness ahead. I didn't want to keep going, but the fog behind me thickened, pressing me forward. The path felt alive, closing in around me with every step. And then, at the end of the trail, I saw it, a small, rotting shack. Its door was slightly open, revealing only darkness inside. My stomach churned as I realized I had nowhere else to go. The shack loomed before me, its wooden walls warped and blackened as if scorched by fire. The door creaked wider on its own, exposing a void of pitch-black darkness inside. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the whispering began again, soft and beckoning, pulling me forward. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the stench of rot. My phone flickered to life in my pocket, the screen casting a faint blue glow. But when I looked at it, my stomach dropped. The screen wasn't showing the time or any app. It was showing me. An image of myself standing in the doorway, frozen in terror. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a low, guttural chant that seemed to come from every corner of the room. I spun around, the beam of light from my phone cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just walls, covered in symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. Then I saw it, the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and ornate, its surface swirling like water. My reflection wasn't mine. It smiled back at me, its eyes dark pits that seemed to stretch endlessly. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection stepped forward, reaching out, its hand pressing against the glass. The surface rippled, and before I could move, its hand broke through, gripping my arm with a cold, unrelenting force. I screamed, but it was too late. The mirror pulled me in, and the last thing I heard was the sound of my own laughter, echoing from the reflection I left behind. I opened my eyes, but the world around me wasn't mine. The street stretched endlessly, twisting into impossible angles, and the sky was an endless, oppressive gray. The shack was gone, the mirror was gone, but I wasn't free. The watchers stood in every window now, their pale faces pressed against the glass, unblinking. The fog swirled around me, whispering my name in faint, mocking voices. I ran, but the streets folded in on themselves, looping endlessly. Then I heard it, my own laughter, distant but growing closer. I wasn't alone here anymore. I never would be again. If you're reading this, don't take the wrong turn. Don't end up like me. Because once you're in this place, you're never getting out. It started as a faint rustling sound, like leaves brushing against one another. I thought it was the wind or a small animal outside, but then the whispers came. Soft, almost too quiet to hear. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. Now, I'm too scared to sleep. Because every night the whispers grow louder, and I'm certain they're coming from my houseplants. It began with a rustling sound, sharp and dry like paper crumpling. It broke through the silence of the house and jolted me awake. My bedroom was pitch dark, but the sound wasn't coming from here. It was coming from the living room. I lay there for a moment, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind outside or the old floorboards settling. But the noise came again, deliberate and clear, like someone brushing against the leaves of my plants. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept out of bed and into the hallway. The living room was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the window, casting long, spindly shadows across the walls. My plants, usually calming and serene, looked ominous, their shapes distorted in the half-light. The rustling stopped the moment I stepped into the room. I froze, listening. my breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, just an unsettling silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. I stared at the fiddle leaf fig, its large leaves glistening faintly. For a moment, I thought I saw one of them move, a subtle quiver, like something alive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed out of the room and shut the door, locking it behind me. That night, I didn't sleep, and somewhere in the darkness, the rustling started again. The rustling returned the very next night, louder than before. It wasn't the soft, harmless sound of leaves brushing together anymore. It had rhythm now, pauses, shifts, and an unmistakable weight, like something moving deliberately among my plants. I lay in bed, gripping my blanket, staring at the closed door to the living room. I could hear it clearly this time. A faint shuffling, almost like footsteps, mixed with the rustling. "Stop it," I whispered, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But then I heard it. A whisper. At first, it was too soft to understand, just a faint murmur weaving through the night. I held my breath, straining to listen. Words began to form, low and broken, in a language I didn't recognize. My stomach knotted as my mind raced to make sense of it. Unable to take it anymore, I threw off the blanket and crept toward the living room. My fingers trembled as I turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, and the sound stopped. The moonlight spilled across my plants, their leaves glistening faintly. They were perfectly still, but the room felt alive, charged with something I couldn't see. And then, just as I stepped forward, one of the plants moved. The fiddle leaf fig shifted, its largest leaf quivering, almost like it was breathing. The whispers started again, this time, louder, clearer, and undeniably coming from the plants themselves. I slammed the door shut and backed away, the whispers echoing in my ears. Something was horribly wrong, and I knew it wasn't going to stop. The next morning, I found dirt on the living room floor. A small pile sat just beneath the fiddle leaf fig, dark and damp, as if something had been digging. My hands trembled as I cleaned it up, trying to ignore the icy feeling creeping up my spine. That night, the whispers came back, sharper and clearer. They didn't sound random anymore. There was a rhythm to them, a chilling cadence that made my chest tighten. I pressed my pillow over my ears, but the sound cut through, louder and more insistent. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the living room again, my heart nearly stopped. The plants had moved. Not much, just an inch or two, but enough to notice. The fiddle leaf fig was leaning forward, its large leaves angled toward the couch like it was listening for something. The whispers grew louder as I stood there, frozen in place. This time, I caught fragments of words. "Leave. Now." One voice hissed. "Don't listen," another whispered, almost pleading. I backed away, my skin crawling. The room felt alive, pulsing with an energy that wasn't mine. As I turned to leave, I tripped over something hard. Looking down, I saw a small, cracked pot. It wasn't one of mine. I didn't recognize it at all. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping into a cacophony of warnings. I slammed the door and locked it, feeling their unseen presence pressing closer. That was the first time I truly understood. Whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. They were trying to warn me. But warn me of what? I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the warnings, the feeling of being watched. It was driving me mad. I needed proof, something to tell me I wasn't imagining it. So I set up a camera in the living room. The plan was simple. Let the camera run all night, keep the door shut, and review the footage in the morning. Maybe then I'd finally understand what was happening. The whispers started earlier than usual, faint and scattered, like they knew I was listening. I sat in my bedroom, trembling, as the sound grew louder. Through the door, I heard a strange rustling, followed by what sounded like soft, deliberate tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. The hours dragged by. I couldn't sleep, couldn't move. When the whispers finally stopped around dawn, I rushed to the camera with shaking hands. The footage started innocently enough, just the stillness of the room and the faint sound of leaves brushing together. But at 3:12 a.m., everything changed. The fiddle leaf fig trembled violently, its leaves shaking as though caught in a storm. The ivy on the walls moved, its tendrils curling and uncurling like they were alive. Then a shadow passed across the room, not cast by anything visible. It stopped in front of the camera and lingered. The screen flickered, and a distorted face appeared for a split second, twisted, pale, and staring directly at the lens. The video ended abruptly, leaving me frozen in terror. Whatever was happening wasn't just inside my head, it was real, and now it knew I was watching. The living room felt colder than ever that night, though the heat was on full blast. I sat in the corner of the couch, hugging my knees, unable to take my eyes off the plants. Their leaves seemed darker now, the green drained to a sickly gray in the dim light of the lamp. I tried to rationalize the footage from the night before, telling myself it was a glitch, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, the presence. The plants weren't just alive, they were watching me. As the clock struck midnight, the shadows on the walls began to shift. At first they were subtle, just flickers in the corners of my vision. But then they grew bolder, stretching across the walls like claws reaching for me. The ivy moved first, its tendrils curling and uncurling as if breathing. Then the fiddle leaf fig's largest leaves began to sway, though there was no breeze. The whispers returned, low and rhythmic, blending into a language I still couldn't understand. I turned toward the lamp for comfort, but its light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't cast by me or the plants. It stood in the center of the room, tall and jagged, its form shifting like smoke. My chest tightened as it moved toward me, slow and deliberate. Behind it, the plants trembled violently, their whispers rising into a frantic cacophony. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. But even from the safety of my bedroom, I could feel them. Watching, waiting, growing stronger. And I knew, no matter how much I tried to escape, the shadows wouldn't stop. They were inside my house now. Inside me. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. The shadows, the whispers, the shifting plants. They were all closing in on me. Desperation drove me to call Julia, a botanist friend who had always loved my collection. She arrived late in the afternoon, her cheery smile fading the moment she stepped into my house. "What's that smell?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. I hadn't noticed it before, but now the air felt thick, heavy with a damp, earthy scent that clung to everything. Julia moved toward the fiddle leaf fig, her fingers grazing its trembling leaves. "This isn't right," she muttered, crouching to inspect the soil. Her face paled as she dug a little deeper. From the blackened soil, she pulled out something small and jagged, a bone. It was no bigger than a finger, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. "Where did this come from?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the whispers began again, louder than ever, filling the room with a sinister cadence. Julia froze, her eyes darting to the plants as their leaves quivered violently. "They're moving," she stammered, backing away. The shadows returned, curling along the walls, darker and sharper than before. One shadow stretched toward Julia, its long, spindly shape reaching like a hand. "Get out!" I screamed, grabbing her arm and dragging her to the door. We barely made it outside before the door slammed shut behind us. From the other side, the whispers turned into screams. Whatever was in my house wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it didn't want us to leave. When I returned to the house the next day, the air felt different, heavier, as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for me to step inside. Julia had begged me not to come back, but I couldn't leave. This was my home, or at least it had been. I opened the door, and the smell hit me first. damp soil, decaying leaves, and something sharper, metallic, that made my stomach churn. The living room was dark, even though the curtains were wide open. The plants loomed larger than before, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me, locking on its own. Panic surged through me as I pulled at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that filled my ears. The fiddle leaf fig shifted, its largest leaf twisting toward me like a grotesque, watchful eye. The ivy began to move, its tendrils stretching across the walls and ceiling, curling like fingers reaching for prey. "Let me go!" I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the whispers. They weren't just warning me anymore. They were taunting me. The shadows gathered in the corner, growing darker and more solid, forming something almost human. Its head tilted, as if mocking my fear, and its hand stretched out toward me. I was trapped. There was no way out, and the house was alive, hungry, waiting to consume me whole. The shadows surrounded me, shifting and writhing as if alive. The whispers had turned into deafening roars, voices overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my back pressed against the locked door. There was no escape. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its form barely human, its movements jerky and unnatural. The plants around me seemed to swell, their leaves twisting toward the figure like they were bowing. The fiddle leaf fig stretched higher, its branches reaching for the ceiling, its largest leaf turning to face me like an unblinking eye. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the center of the room. The ivy shifted, revealing a gaping hole in the floor I hadn't seen before. A black void yawned beneath me, pulsing with a faint red glow. I realized what they wanted. I could leave the house, but only if I made a choice. I could walk into the darkness, into whatever horror waited below, or I could stay and let the house consume me piece by piece. My body trembled as I stepped toward the hole. A single word echoed in my mind. Choose. I took a breath and made my decision. The door behind me unlocked. But I knew, deep down, I would never truly leave. What would you do if your houseplant started watching you? Would you dare to listen? If you dare, share this story, but be warned. Every retelling brings the whispers closer to you. At first, I thought she was just waiting for someone. A woman standing under the streetlight, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face. But as the hours passed, she didn't move, not even a step. She just stood there, staring at my house. And now, I'm afraid to look out the window again. It was late, past midnight, when I first saw her. The rain was coming down hard, a relentless downpour that rattled against the windows and turned the streets into rivers of shimmering black. I had been lying on the couch, scrolling aimlessly on my phone when something caught my eye through the blinds. There she was. A woman, standing perfectly still under the dim, flickering streetlight across the street. She wasn't holding an umbrella or wearing a raincoat, just a thin dress that clung to her body in the rain. Her head was slightly tilted down, and her long, dark hair covered most of her face. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was waiting for a cab or someone to pick her up. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized she wasn't moving. She wasn't fidgeting, shivering, or even looking around. She just stood there, her feet planted like she'd grown roots into the wet pavement. I turned off the lamp, suddenly feeling exposed, and peered through the blinds again. Her head had lifted slightly. I couldn't see her face, but I felt it, like she was staring directly at my house. I tried to brush it off. People do strange things all the time, right? Maybe she was waiting for someone or lost her way. But there was something about her, something that made my skin crawl. The rain poured harder, the steady rhythm pounding against the windows. She didn't move. Hours passed, and the clock on the wall ticked endlessly, but her silhouette remained frozen under the flickering streetlight. The only movement was her hair, fluttering in the wind, soaked and clinging to her face. I tried to ignore her, but the unease gnawed at me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the front door, stepping into the cold rain, the icy drops soaking me instantly. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. She didn't respond. Instead, her head tilted ever so slightly, just enough to let me know she was aware of me. My heart stopped. The movement wasn't natural, it felt deliberate, purposeful, like she was acknowledging my presence without needing to say a word. A cold shiver ran down my spine and I slammed the door shut, locking it in one swift motion. I didn't dare look outside again. When I woke up the next morning, she was gone. Relief flooded through me as I peeked out the window. The streetlight was still flickering, the pavement glistening from the rain, but there was no trace of her. I went about my day trying to push the memory out of my mind. But as the sun set and darkness crept in, unease settled in my chest. I didn't want to look out the window. I didn't want to know if she was back. But something compelled me. When I finally gathered the courage to peek through the blinds, my stomach dropped. She was there again, in the exact same spot. Her head was tilted slightly down, and her arms hung limply at her sides. The rain hadn't started yet, but her dress was already soaked, clinging to her body like she'd never dried off. This time, I knew something was wrong. I decided to call the police. As I explained the situation, I felt foolish. A woman standing across the street wasn't exactly a crime. But as I spoke, I glanced out the window again and froze. She had moved. She wasn't under the streetlight anymore. She was closer, standing at the edge of my driveway. Her face was still obscured, but I could feel her eyes on me, sharp and unrelenting. The operator's voice crackled in my ear. "Sir? Are you still there?" I need someone to come check this out," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The knock came before I hung up. It was slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet house. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a third, each one more forceful than the last. "Please leave," I shouted, my voice shaking. But there was no response. The knocking stopped, and the silence was worse. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, clutching my phone like a lifeline. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, she was gone again. The police arrived not long after. I explained everything to the officer, feeling like a paranoid fool as I described the woman and her eerie stillness. He nodded, scribbling notes, but his expression remained neutral. "Let me take a look around," he said, stepping out into the cold night. I watched from the window as he shone his flashlight around the yard and up and down the street. When he returned, his face was grim. "There's no one out there," he said, "but I did find this." He handed me a small, soggy piece of paper. Written in smudged ink were 3 words: "Let me in." After the officer left, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. I tried to tell myself it was over, that she wouldn't come back. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night. When I finally drifted off, I woke to the sound of dripping water. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. It was coming from inside the house. I crept toward the sound, my bare feet cold against the floor. The dripping grew louder, more persistent, as I approached the living room. When I turned the corner, my breath caught in my throat. There was a puddle on the floor, dark and glistening. And standing in the middle of it was the woman. Her head lifted slowly, revealing a face pale and lifeless, her eyes wide and unblinking. Water dripped from her hair and dress, pooling around her feet. "You didn't let me in," she whispered, her voice raspy and hollow, stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman stepped closer, her soaked dress clinging to her frail body, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though her limbs didn't belong to her. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling as I searched for anything to defend myself. My hand found the cold metal base of a lamp, and I gripped it tightly. I mean it. She tilted her head, the movement slow and deliberate. Her wet hair parted slightly, revealing a pale, hollow face. Her eyes, wide and glassy, seemed to pierce through me, unblinking and filled with something unnatural. "Why didn't you let me in?" she rasped, her voice a hollow echo that seemed to come from all directions. Panic surged, and I hurled the lamp at her. It shattered at her feet, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she took another step forward, her feet trailing water that pooled beneath her. The air around me grew impossibly cold, so thick with the scent of rain and decay that I gagged. "You let me watch," she hissed, her voice sharp and accusing, her head twitching unnaturally. "Now you'll listen." Her voice changed, splitting into whispers, screams, and sounds that didn't belong in this world. They flooded my head, growing louder and louder until I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears. The room spun as the sound consumed me. The last thing I saw was her hand, pale and dripping, reaching for me. When I woke up, the house was silent. The puddle was gone, and so was she. But I knew it wasn't over. The next night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window staring at the streetlight, waiting for her to return. She hasn't come back yet, but the whispers haven't stopped. If you ever see a woman standing in the rain staring at your house, don't watch her too long. And whatever you do, don't let her in. Are you sure you're alone? Or is she waiting for you, just outside your window?